Okay, everybody, here we are with our lecture on nature and art for attention. This is probably the most complicated talk for me to give because it's pretty much what I do, what I've been doing for the past 20 years and more, 25 years for that matter. And there's so much you want to say, so much you want to squeeze in, the feeling of being incomplete burdens you so much more than other presentations on different topics where you feel sort of entitled to cherry pick and mix and omit. But in this case, I'll try to do my best to create a cohesive vision that will be useful for you. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this course, I had the opportunity to work in the field of animal studies for since roughly 2000, 2001. Animal studies is a new discipline. I say new now, it's kind of like 20 years old, but in academic terms, it's kind of new. And it has really become mainstream, many claim, over the past 5 to 10 years. You probably know Donna Haraway, who's mostly a posthuman author or an author associated with posthumanism and who has become central to animal studies, especially when her book, When Species Meet, was published a few years back. We will look at notions of posthumanism as well in the context of this lecture, but I will try to keep the focus on animals and plants also in relation to animal studies more readily to simplify things. There will be a section towards the end about bioart, but again, these are all topics that would require a lecture in their own right if we had the time. I just say that so that you can approach this lecture in the right with the right frame of mind, but also explore these topics further in their own right if you have the time. So, as I said earlier, many years spent in the field. I've published quite a few books on animals and plants in art. And I have been this is my latest book. It's actually about Lucian Freud and his paintings of plants that have been neglected by art historians. You'll find out that nature is the underdog of contemporary subjects. There's a lot of controversy also about the current climate change and Anthropocene emphasis that some institutions are suddenly giving to the subject, why this is the case, and how is it that nature has been sidelined for pretty much 400 years in art, considered a subgenre. And then today we're all like starting to realize that nature exists. It creates a really strange, almost hypocritical paradigm in which we're all caught up, and by extension, we've all caused in a way or another. So, Lucian Freud Herbarium was an attempt on my part to hijack one of the most famous artists in the history of Western art, who's very well known for the representation of the naked body, so very anthropocentric dimension, and actually show how a lot of his painterly philosophy comes from painting plants and painting plants in a way to attune himself to something deeper that then eventually becomes a tool he uses upon the human and everything else he paints. So, beyond doing this, I also published Antennae, the Journal of Nature in Visual Culture, which is now over 13 years old, 50 issues published at present. One of the most relevant reference points for nature in art. It's all free to the public and independent. So this is certainly one of my most exciting projects. Tons of collaborations. I love collaborating with people who can expand my views and enrich my conceptions of things. So hence this journal that's published now 3 times a year. So here we go. I wanted to play you this clip. I'm sure many of you will remember immediately where it comes from.
Do you like our owl?
It's artificial?
Of course it is.
Must be expensive.
Very.
Okay, that was Blade Runner. I'm sure you're all familiar with the film, and you'll understand through the course of the lecture why I'm showing you this. But I wanted to just expose this beautiful sequence with this.
The parakeet. So beautiful, great to look at, and what a wonderful companion. But live birds can be a lot of work. Well, now you can share that beauty without the mess. With Perfect Polly, the singing parakeet. Perfect Polly is so lifelike, it's the world's perfect pet. And it never needs feeding. It's motion activated, so any movement makes Perfect Polly come to life. Watch as Perfect Polly's head moves back and forth, along with its tail feathers. And Polly's chirping is as sweet and beautiful as a real live parakeet. You'll get all the joy without the mess or expense. Perfect Polly will touch your heart and brighten any room in your home. It's actually life-size, and so amazingly lifelike, you'll almost believe it's real. In fact, even this live parakeet can't tell the difference. Enjoy Perfect Polly's company while you're making dinner or relaxing with a good book. Your entire family will love the fun you'll have with Perfect Polly, the singing parakeet. Perfect Polly even makes a great companion for your other pets. It's ideal for condos or small homes that aren't pet-friendly. And unlike real birds, you can turn Perfect Polly off with the touch of a button. Perfect Polly comes with its own perch, or Polly can just sit on your finger and serenade you. Live parakeets need a cage, food, and multiple accessories. That can add up to a lot of money. But Perfect Polly, complete with perch, is yours for only $14.99. Perfect Polly is also available in blue, red, or purple. Perfect Polly, the singing parakeet, is yours for only $14.99. So call and order your Perfect Polly now.
Oh, wow. Did you know about Perfect Polly? Every time I watch this, which is not often, trust me, I actually, it's just, it cracks me up. There is so much truth in advertising, you know. That's why snobby academics who don't kind of look at advertising as an index of our cultural temperature miss out on a lot of insights. There's so much we could say about this. We're not going to say much, but I just wanted to highlight one of my interests in looking at animals, plants, and our conception of nature in my books is that I tend to approach it from the perspective of capitalism, because nature is being commodified in our time like anything else. You know, capitalism envelopes everything we do. It's the air we breathe. And this is just a quintessential materialization of what some of us, I'm saying some of us here, would love their pets to be something that you can turn off, right? When you don't really want to put up with them anymore, but also something available in different colors. How practical. Something that doesn't cost much, you know. It really empties the bird of anything that's bird-like and turns it into this empty mechanical shell. But also I'm interested in the mechanization of the animal, in the conception of posthumanism here as well. So I think it's generally a really fitting opener. You'll see how it works if you bring it back to your memories and minds throughout the lecture. Before we make more connections, where do you start with a lecture like this? I mean, it's just like madness. Do you cut out all the old stuff and start from contemporary? I could have, but for the sake of being comprehensive and at times even perhaps a little rushed, I really wanted to create a context for the representation of animals and plants in art. The first thing we painted is probably animals, right, on cave walls. And the meaning of these animals, as you know, might have something to do with spirituality, accessing a different dimension in which animals know more. So perhaps animals as equal or bigger than humans, entities to with which anyway we communicate, which is really fascinating. Different culture represents animals in different ways, of course. This beautiful piece exhibited at the British Museum in London, Fowling in the Marshes, is a hunting scene. And, you know, hunting, feeding on animals is one of the dimensions that historically has defined our relationships to the non-human. Think about loving and killing, right? This is the paradigm that and the contradiction that defines our relationship with animals, and that still today farmers know so much about. Animal studies, of course, started in an interesting way where scholars who worked in cities from around the world began to think about why have animals been omitted from philosophy, why are animals treated like a joke in art, why are animals sidelined in literature. And their experiences were mostly urban or a mix of urban and rural. And those scholars who came from rural realities, from farmland, also said, look, it's not quite as easy as saying, we love animals, we want to protect all animals, and we want to save them. There's ethical questions that apply to wild animals, and there are ethical questions that apply to farm animals. And those who farm animals in a way that doesn't entail mass slaughter have feelings for the animals they live with throughout the year, but then have to face that moment of killing when time comes. And these are all negotiations we have to mediate and work our lives through with empathy and with presence. So hunting, very tricky subject in the history of animals and humans, but also in the history of animal representation. And animals as symbols. This is one of the biggest issues that I'm going to come back to over and over and over through this lecture. Now, here in this Egyptian work, Falling in the Marshes, the animals are not symbols of anything specifically. These are animals that populate the hunting scene, right? And there's something important here. But in this case, we see sheep. The sheep are not sheep. They actually are us. They are the faithfuls. Curiosity, the tails of sheep are long, and we cut them, we clip them, right? That's why they're short. They're clipped by farmers when the sheep is young, because otherwise sheep kept in herd have the tendency to chew each other's tails, and that leads to infections and diseases. End of curiosity. The real point here is that the tradition of Western art especially has objectified animals by treating them as symbols. And this carries important repercussions in our relationship with animals. It means that we can't see them most often for what they are, but we actually see them as vehicles of our preoccupations, as vehicle of our moral and ethical constructions. And we'll see how this works, but it's a really important point. And of course, the first representations of animals in books appear on bestiaria. Now, the bestiarium is a really interesting medieval book, one of the bestsellers of the Middle Ages. And again, animals appear in the bestiarium as religious symbols. They're part of stories and narratives that have got nothing to do with the animals themselves. Don't forget that at this point, we are not, the world doesn't know science in the traditional sense. The Greek works of Aristotle and Plato are actually in the Arab world, and they have been translated in Arabic. Italy, France, Germany are really immersed in the Middle Ages, which is a completely different cultural milieu, extremely religious, and the word of God pervades absolutely everything. So no surprise that the interest for animal representation is not in understanding animals. The emphasis is not on understanding animals, but it's actually in using animals as representations of God on earth, or as metaphors that belong and pertain to the divine alone. Therefore, animals don't look naturalistic. You can see that camel is blue, the trees look like some strange asparagus trees, the dragons, I still believe don't exist. The image on the left is actually the representation of the church, and the plant, which is also an imaginary plant, symbolizes the church. The doves are the faithful. The higher on the branches you are, hence the closer to God, the safer you are from the devil, represented by the dragons that are eating the doves at the base of it. As you can see, there's no real interest here, no desire to scrutinize natural life, but just a desire to understand God's creation and narrate God's creation. And then, of course, things get more interesting when it comes to herbaria. Now, herbaria are different from bestiaria or bestiaries. The herbaria are a medical resource. And the representations we see here are designed to allow people to recognize plants in the wild so that they can be used for medicinal remedies. And you can imagine that these illustrations wouldn't really get you far. So it doesn't take long before realism is introduced in art in order to identify the species of plants more accurately. This is one of the most beautiful ways of representing plants in the work of Pietro Andrea Mattioli, who was a physician in Siena. And the plates are actually illustrated by Gerardo Cibo, who was a fantastic botanist of the time, who also invented the herbarium. Sorry, the herbarium with the pressed specimens. After he invents the herbarium with the pressed specimens, in the English world, the represented plants, the books, sorry, with represented plants are called herbals, and the ones with dried specimen herbarium. But here you can see how Gerardo Cibo is really representing the plant in a way that it can be recognized in the wild, and also contextualizes it within the landscape in which it grows. So he actually is one of the earliest inventors of the ecological thinking when it comes to botany. And art is caught up in these two polarities, right? The religious representation of the imaginary animals and the scientific accuracy, especially during the Renaissance. This is Paolo Uccello, who was a Renaissance artist who, by the way, was more caught up in the Middle Ages than in the Renaissance. And you can see here his representation of a dragon, clearly emerging from the Middle Ages. But his representation of a horse is also not particularly naturalistic. And that's because at this point, artists don't look at real animals in order to represent them on canvas or on the board. So this is really important because the empirical system, right, Aristotle's empirical system reemerges during the Renaissance with the revival of classical art, with the revival of Greek culture. And looking at animals really changes the history and the representation of nature in art. These are sketches by Leonardo, who we know practiced dissection of animal bodies in order to understand the way muscles and bones constitute the structure of animal bodies, and so that he could represent them as in the most naturalistic way possible. At the same time as a real interest for animals begins to emerge, we also find the emergence of cabinets of curiosities. Cabinets of curiosities are one of the most fascinating cultural endeavors of the Renaissance. And they're basically collections of wealthy patrons like princes, kings, and aristocrats who wanted to let's say, develop their knowledge on the world, also because that ennobling of themselves led to stronger power. So they have the ability to purchase, they have the financial fluidity necessary to purchase these objects. Most of them don't come from their travels discovering or exploring the world, as sometimes they claim, but they're actually purchased in markets in Florence and Rome. But they are the beginning of modern museums. The Cabinet of Curiosities is a place in which power and knowledge can ignite this circularity where one promotes the other and one promotes the other. What is made visible in the Cabinet of Curiosities is what is deemed worthy of learning, exploring, and embodying. So there is something really fascinating about this moment in which the natural world suddenly becomes connected and caught up in power relations like never before. The more animals, specimens you have collected, the more kudos you have among your wealthy peers. And look how beautiful this painting of a Cabinet of Curiosities by Domenico Remps is. It really symbolizes everything that Cabinets of Curiosities stood for at the time, especially if you focus on the top corner on the right, you will see a skull with a red coral attached to its forehead. The red coral had a religious symbolism connected to the Passion of Christ. And of course, the skull is just pretty self-explanatory, represents death. So these paintings of Cabinets of Curiosities, as well as the Cabinets of Curiosities, embody an existentialist quest. The question underlying everything here is, what is life? What is the position, the situation of man in life itself? And what are we to make of the abundance of beautiful animals, plants, and materials, minerals that we find in nature? And as you can see in the Cabinets of Curiosities, art and natural objects intermingle, which is particularly interesting. So the representation of animals in art becomes more and more naturalistic, especially in Western art during the Renaissance. It's part of the trend, the revival of classical art, but it's also driven by the Aristotelian empirical system, the idea that artists should really be looking at their animals and plants before they paint them. Also because the most accurate representations are sought after by the princes and kings, because again, animals, although they're represented realistically, haven't been freed from the symbolic burden. This is actually a complicated painting that I can't really explain here. But The Lady with the Ermine by Leonardo has a bit of a mistake in it. This is not an ermine. An ermine is cute. This is a ferret. You know, ferrets are like much larger. As you can see, it's got a bit of a mean snout. And some art historians have actually come to dispute the attribution of this painting to Leonardo, because they claim he could have never gotten the ermine wrong. But that's a different story. What's interesting here is that the lady with the ermine is not cuddling an ermine slash ferret because that's her beloved pet, but it's meant to be the emblem of the family of her lover. So it's a portrait that implicitly tells the viewer who's in the know, who's in the loop, that that is her connection with the family of a lover. Again, symbolic meaning. And we find the symbolic meaning recurring over and over with the appearance of other animals in this beautiful painting by Titian, juxtaposed again to the early natural history treatises where animals are objectified in a different way. So we can easily claim that animals are pretty much objectified in two different ways. One is a symbolic way. They become vehicles for our moral and ethical concerns. The other is that they're stripped off any sort of mystique of any kind, and they become these objects to study in detail on the pages of natural history treatises. And as you can see, the representation of the animal is also telling of this objectification in aesthetic terms. The animal is extrapolated from the natural world, right? The image I showed you earlier of that peony by Gerardo Cibo is unique in the fact that his approach was to keep the plant in the environment, in the background. Instead, natural history moves on to an isolation of the animal, and the plain background becomes the essence of the scientific table, right? The idea of isolating, focusing, and extrapolating that are so central to science and natural history are very much evident in the illustration itself. I actually wrote extensively about this phenomenon in my book, Speculative Taxidermy, and I wrote about it in the context of Foucault and the panopticon. So those of you who know what these are might enjoy reading the chapter that's about natural history illustration, what I call the panopticon of nature, which unfortunately I don't have time to explore in depth here. And again, more and more symbolism and objectification during the still life explosion of the 17th century, representing animals, dead animals, in the context of the vanitas, the paintings that reminded us that all the pleasure and beauty in life is transitional, represent wealth, right? In order to hunt, in order to have a painting of game made like this was really expensive. So this is again the domain of the rich. And what tells us again that this is the domain of the rich is that African gray parrot right at the top of the basket, one of the most fashionable and expensive pets in the history of Europe. So again, displaying animals not because of an interest necessarily in animals, but because they express notions of power or status symbols. That's always a constant with animals. Other still lives, like this one by Claes, show us a lobster in the foreground, which was an aphrodisiac and therefore bears mythological as well as sexual references. Again, the lobster, as you can see, is also cooked. It's not in its natural green, bluish color. Therefore, there is no real interest in the painting and understanding the animal itself. Everything else here is suggestive, symbolic of something else, including the oysters that symbolize femininity, the lemon and the peel apparently symbolize purity because lemon had the ability to disinfect and cleanse everything involving metal and involving wounds. The basket that we see on the right hand side, it's symbolizing the passion of Christ, and the bread, of course, again, part of that Christian symbolism. So you can see how nature was used over and over to basically express our beliefs. This is a masterpiece that is at the Art Institute of Chicago, and one of my favorite paintings since I was a child. I didn't know I was going to end up working with it live later on in life. Snyder is a fantastic painter of animals, but especially when they're dead. When he paints them alive, he kind of flunks a little. But this is a market stall, and it's a really complicated painting in which every animal we see here on this table as a religious symbolism, and that's why these animals are painted. You can see on the left hand side that we have a child stealing the earnings of the gentleman on the left. It's no coincidence that the money that's being stolen is right underneath this basket. The figs symbolize wealth, right? So this corner of the painting is all about wealth. The child stealing from the older man represents the two different moments in the journey of life. The elderly man has clearly accomplished a lot in his life because he's worked very hard under the positive omen of Christianity. And you can see right next to him, just to confirm, that there is a basket filled with grapes, the Passion of Christ, and apples, the capital sin. There is also a pear, which symbolizes femininity, and it's associated with the Madonna. And then there's all these animals, the white dove taking flight, symbolizing the Holy Spirit. The boar symbolizes gluttony. The peacock symbolizes resurrection. The hare symbolizes purity of heart. And one of the most fascinating symbols here is the swan, because the swan that we today associate with love actually symbolized the seed. The seed because the plumage of the bird is white and the skin underneath is black. So once plucked, the birds reveal its real identity, and therefore the deceit that it embodied. At the bottom, you see two cockerels fighting, which is part of the struggle of life. Some claim good and evil, but there is also a black cat gazing and waiting to pounce on the one that will be made weaker by the other. The other vegetables that we see scattered around represent autumn and the notion of the harvest. So they symbolize this idea of life that's being well lived. As you can see, nothing in this painting, despite the fact that we see animals painted in an absolutely outstanding naturalism, is about animals, apart perhaps from the metaphor of the swan, which again, it's brought back to our quarters with the notion that the swan is about the seed. The swan doesn't care about the seed, right? It's just the way it is. And meanwhile, natural history really raises the bar during the 19th century. This is Audubon and his beautiful illustrations that aim, again, at contextualizing animals to a certain degree, but they also glamorize animals. We're going to talk about what this glamorization of animals in natural history does. Before we get there, we can never forget religion. And I say this because it plays an incredibly powerful role in not just in the history of animal representation, but also in the history of our conception of nature. So the painting by Cranach that I just showed you here is of Adam and Eve before they ruined everything, right? So you can see the Garden of Eden is a beautiful place of lush vegetation filled with animals that happily coexist with us and with each other. There's even a lion there just peacefully lurking like a cat. And right over here, you see what happens after, right? The beautiful lushness of that landscape, it's turned into a desert in this fresco by Masaccio. And Adam and Eve find themselves naked. This is how technically Christianity constructed the idea of nature as separate from us. The chase from the Garden of Eden, see, in this case, Adam and Eve are not aware of their nakedness as shame, is really a metaphor of our becoming human. And at this point, the animals have gone. They don't want to have anything with us anymore. We let the whole garden down and we're responsible for our suffering and pain. Isn't that interesting when you look at it from this perspective? And this man knew a thing or two about religion. He happens to be, Rene Dakar, one of the most powerful thinkers of the 17th century. His thinking reverberates through the history of Western culture and then world culture, even when his name is not attached to the theories that really made him so powerful. What did Descartes say? Well, Descartes is responsible, in part at least, for defining and crystallizing the human-animal dichotomy. What do we mean by that? As pointed out by Foucault, natural history began to gather momentum when history became natural, or in other words, when animal semantics became to be stripped off the animal in order to enable the formation of a different nature optic. A transition which took place at the same time as the Cartesian reduction of everything into its simplest constituent parts left nothing larger than the sum of these parts. What does this mean? It means that during the 17th century, especially with the rise of colonialism, the rise of interest in natural history, because of all the new specimens of animals and plants that arrived from faraway land, the world of natural history, which is just barely making sense of European animals, Indian animals, and Chinese animals, which were known at the time, is engulfed by an enormous amount of animals and plants that they feel the need to classify. The images of natural history I showed you earlier, the animals against the plain background, are partly the manifestation of the impossibility of knowing exactly what the ecosystems and landscapes these animals inhabited looked like. Because the natural historians are in Europe and they receive the specimens from the colonialist journeys in places like London, Paris. The animals happen to be already dead most of the time, and that's why they look very awkward, even when you think, gosh, you couldn't make a better representation of an elephant or another animal that could have been painted better. A lot of it has got to do with these animals being skinned and arriving only as skins in Europe. Later on, then naturalists will actually get onto ships themselves and make as much work as possible on site. But it was hard. Time was limited. The situation, the conditions were arduous. So this disconnect between the geography and the animal life is a constant throughout the natural history of the 17th century. What are animal semantics, you might be wondering? Well, the animal semantics are the meanings embedded in animals, or let's say the cultural signification, the cultural enmeshment of animals in our lives. So, for instance, during the Middle Ages, the animal semantics entailed anything. So, a swan could be a symbol of something, but how you cook a swan is also part of the semantics. It's religious symbolism. They were connected to histories and traditions, even if they symbolized something other than themselves. They played a cultural role in our minds. But when the animals begin to arrive from the colonies in ways that nobody could have anticipated, these animals are real strangers. They're real others, in a sense. They come with no connected history to the people of Europe, and therefore they are immediately objectified. This process of objectification is also perpetrated by Descartes in his conceptualization of the animal. So you can see here how, again, the animal is extrapolated, is taken out from its environment, it turns into this object to look at. But then Descartes comes along with this insistence that animals were nothing more than automata, regulated by a principle governing clockworks, expressed in his highly influential discourses on the methods from 1637, and that therefore they could not feel pain. Do you see this really important connection? Descartes goes as far as saying animals are clockworks and therefore they don't feel pain. This led to the vivisection of animals without the use of any anesthetics and greatly contributed to the objectification of animal bodies, which, as it will be argued later in this chapter, was being simultaneously proposed by means of representational strategies in the new spatializations provided by the natural history illustration. So there's something really important here about the idea that animals are clockwork, they don't feel pain, and that therefore we are enabled to do whatever we like to animals. It gave us agency to develop the plans of the slaughterhouse. It gave us agency to develop this belief that animals don't feel and don't understand. We still see this today. You talk to people, some people perpetrate these stereotypes about animals, and even the most illuminated people will still repeat falsities such as goldfish have no memory. You know, these are all popular culture myths that have been debunked by science a long time ago, or that lobsters don't feel pain. Have you ever looked at a lobster when he sees a pot with boiling water? It doesn't scream, "Put me in it," does it? It really tries to push back just at the feeling the heat. You know, animals are sentient. We need to really get this idea in our minds. And now how we handle that ethical dilemma on what we do with this sentience is certainly different from denying sentience to animals, which is basically what we've done since Descartes especially. So most of Descartes' argument for animal inferiority relied upon the claim that animals cannot produce reasoned speech, therefore demonstrating the lacking of rational souls. And this is how religion loops us back into the notion of inferiority of animals. Animals are denied souls. And again, if you've got nothing to do and you want to depress yourselves one night, just Google it. And you will find that many people are still discussing this in forums where they suddenly become concerned, religious people become concerned that their dog Betsy died, and will I meet Betsy in heaven? And these are questions that pop up all the time because the church says no, the church says yes, the church says maybe. So the question of, will animals be in heaven? Is heaven like a place without animals? I mean, it goes on and on and on. Today, 2020, this is all coming out of ideas that have been around us with centuries and that really shape our relationship with animals and objectification. This is one of the most gruesome and really groundbreaking paintings made at the time, in which Descartes was thinking his conceptions of the automata. And it's fascinating how ultimately these ideas are kind of caught up in the impossibility of really seeing animals as equal because our desire to eat them, right? It just becomes this non-straightforward, constant tumbling into ethical issues. So in Treatise of Man, he describes a fountain, this is Descartes, describes a fountain in the royal gardens of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, which featured, among other machines, an automaton of Diana bathing. Descartes' description of his experience suggests excitement and awe for the machines, which can perform movement but nevertheless lack rational souls. So again, we're trying to link the connection between automata and animals, the lack of a soul, Now remember perfect poly, right? That's why perfect poly came into the picture. There's a connection here, but as you will see, there's also a connection with posthumanism and the blurring of the boundaries between animal, human, and machine that we will get to. This is a fantastic painting as well from the 18th century, which again shows us the fraught relationship between science and empathy. This is an experiment designed to demonstrate the existence of a vacuum. The bird that we see in the pump is the pet owned by the two girls that we see on the right hand side. The cage at the very top on the right tells us this was their pet, and it's being sacrificed in the name of science. The air contained in the chamber, in the glass chamber at the top, will be allowed to escape as it warms up, resulting in the suffocation of the bird. These were experiments, pseudo-scientific experiments that happened a lot in rich homes. It was a form of entertainment / education. I thought the people that were staging these events were not real scientists most of the time. But this is also a fantastic painting in the way in which it reassesses the gender stereotypes that orbit around the very notion of knowledge, scientific knowledge, and naturalistic knowledge. You can see how the girls are represented as squeamish and barely able to digest. The vision, the two men on the left-hand side, probably father and son, are determined and focused, confidently staring death in the face. The elderly man on the right-hand side looks somewhat melancholic and sad, probably contemplating death on a more personal ground. And on the very left, the couple in love couldn't give a damn. Now, representation of animals and objectification, animals as symbols. Look at these two horses, very different they are. On the left-hand side, one horse has clearly been to the salon. The mane is incredible, very dramatized. On the right-hand side, George Stubbs' Whistle Jacket is still a beautiful horse, idealized to a certain degree, but there's a main difference between the two. The difference is that Whistle Jacket doesn't have a rider. On the left-hand side, Napoleon crossing the Alps by David is a celebration of Napoleon's power. The horse is actually a tool. And believe it or not, Napoleon didn't even ride horses on the Alps because they don't work particularly well. He rode a donkey. But you can see why a donkey would have not been good for a royal portrait, right? Instead, on the right-hand side, Whistle Jacket appears bare in its own presence. And that's what really matters. This is a turning point in the history of Western art. It's probably the first animal to be given a super large canvas. This is life-size and with no background. In this case, again, it objectifies as well as extrapolates from the narrative of humanity. Think about it. Horses don't go up on the Alps, right? There's no horses on the Alps. So the idea here that the horse is brought on the Alps is basically related to human power. Here the horse is the extension of Napoleon power. It elevates the man, and the horse is smart and beautiful and strategically inclined. So it is really the perfect animal for the situation. It's also about the lineage of aristocracy and the horse. There's a long history there of selective breeding that brings Napoleon and the horse together. Whistle Jacket instead shows an emotional presence. If you look at the eye, the face of the horse, it really captures this important moment of awareness. What's fascinating about Whistle Jacket is that it was a race horse, that it was therefore a celebrity horse, and in a sense it's still caught up in the power relations that we're very familiar with, but it doesn't mean anything in a symbolic way. It doesn't carry any religious connotation, any other moral or ethical judgment. Now I wanted to introduce to you these two different subjects, these conceptions that I'm sure you're familiar with, ego and eco. Now, an egocentric approach to the natural world, as you can see, has a man at the very top, a woman right below, aligned with a whale. And then all the rest of animal and plant creations. As you can see, it's no coincidence that trees and flowers happen to be at the very right at the corner. However, an ecological conception of life sees a de-hierarchization, right, of the order that we have invented, that sees us at the very top of everything. and therefore suggests the importance of an enmeshing of life. Now, I have to say a few words about Darwin and how Darwin's idea during the 19th century contributed to this ego complex that we carry with us today, which is called anthropocentrism. The idea that we are in the middle of everything, that we are God's supreme creation. It always goes back to that. There is an issue with the idea of intelligence, and this kind of infuriates me. So I'm going to try to keep cool as I explain this really. Oh, it's such a concept that shows how stupid we are. We can't put it any other way. But basically, what we have done is assuming that we are the most intelligent of animals, right? So if we accept what Darwin theorized, that we are animals that have developed off other animals, then we are the best animals, because unlike our ancestors, we can speak, we can write, we can communicate, we have a language that we understand, and therefore we have just denied animals of all this. We assume and claim that animals don't communicate with each other. We cast them as stupid and limited, instead of really understanding that the world is made of different kinds of intelligence. Think about a butterfly, for instance. Try to place your mind in the body of a butterfly as far as you possibly can. Think about the life cycle and how a caterpillar goes through a journey that entails metamorphosis in a way that we don't. And what is intelligence in that case? How do they look after themselves? How do they survive to that point? What do they know what they know? And also, if you've observed the life cycles of caterpillars, you know something amazing happens. At some point, the caterpillar will walk away from the host plant. Imagine having lived all their lives on the host plant. That's all they know, technically. That's what we think, that's all they know. And then one day they need to find a spot elsewhere around which they can perform this incredible transformation they have never done before. So how do they choose that spot? How do they find the right spot that will shelter them from the elements as they turn into butterflies? And when they emerge after having been turned into mush inside the butterfly and recompose themselves, how do they know what to do with these massive things that protrude from their backs? How do they know how to fly? Have you ever seen the first flight of a butterfly? If you have the opportunity to see a butterfly that's emerged from a chrysalis in a butterfly house, or if you like supported the life of a caterpillar in a jar and then let it go, you will see that the first flight of a butterfly doesn't look like the sequence of flights that the butterfly can enact afterwards. There's a clear feeling of awkwardness and a clumsiness in the flight that suggests I'm not quite sure what this is, but I'm swimming through it. And whatever comes after, landing on flowers, looking for food that it's different from the food it ate earlier. I mean, this is incredible. It is incredible. And what we have done with this Cartesian conception of animals as machine is impoverishing the natural world for us. All of it. We train our kids to think of nature as a resource instead of showing them how wonderful it is. We teach them that snakes are repulsive. We teach them that this animal or that animal is scary or dangerous, instead of emphasizing the wealth of intelligence that we see in nature. And that is the biggest crime. That's our stupidity. And that's how what we're paying right now. It's all linked to this. It's not just about not recycling. It's not just about not caring. We have done this to ourselves. We have made the world we live in poor because of our complex of superiority. And now the destruction of it all is basically the price we should pay, I actually think. So what is anthropocentric miseducation? It's what I just explained right now. And as I said earlier, it starts as a child, when we're presented with animals as symbols by our parents, because that's all we understand animals to be. And it's in the language, right? Language defines animals. We don't hesitate if we were in a class together right now and I'd ask you to come up with what are the associations you draw between a lion and language, you come up with bravery, right? It's ingrained in us because we have been trained at school to make these associations. Or how do we associate worms? What are the associations we link to worms? As I always, it's a lowly, simple form of life. Again, connected to the ground. Therefore, it's like beneath us. We are vertical beings, erecting ourselves away from the ground and stretching towards God. We're so good at telling ourselves baloney, basically. And, gender stereotypes, the association between girls and frail, or animals that we understand as frails, again, butterflies. If you're a boy and you like butterflies, that was my case when I grew up. Oh my lord, the stigma and the shame. You shouldn't be interested in butterflies. Are you kidding me? Those are for girls. And likewise, boys should be interested in animals that are powerful, that are strong. This is the violence we still perpetrate uh, to our children, and it's ridiculous, through fashion of all things. So this leads me to another important and perhaps even more subtle conception of animality in art that I want you all to be aware of. In the history of art, but also around us most of the time in documentaries as well as photography especially, animals are represented in sublime ways. And our next lecture is on the sublime, so we're going to scavenge that subject then. But here is an animal we could all agree is sublime, right? It's a bald eagle. Look how grand it is, right? We associate the sublime with something that instills awe and admiration, something that feels somewhat bigger than us, not more intelligent, right? Because we are the most intelligent animal in the world, of course, but it's actually greater in some sense. Here's the flip side. We see their greatness as representations of ourselves. Again, anthropocentrism. The bald eagle represents America, right? We've turned it into a symbol, and it's protected also because of that symbolic value. Now, think about the life of the animal. It flies high, beautiful wingspan. It's powerful. It's a predator, right? It carries all these meanings we can't dissociate with the animal. But what about this animal? Is it sublime? Oh no, it ain't. It's our friend the pigeon. Some call it a rat with wings. It's common. It feeds on scraps. It's everywhere around us. They tend to look grubby and, a little unhappy in cities. Not sublime at all. It doesn't capture our imagination in the same way. Nobody wants to associate themselves with pigeons. We're eagles, right? We are dominating the skies. We are up there imbued with power. What about the swan? Now, the swan is beautiful, as we said earlier. Its symbolic meaning changed over time. But this is actually a very important image of love. We associate the swan with love, and we associate the swan with elegance, right? There's something majestic about the swan. But how about this swan? Look at this. Same swan just came out of that river, right? And in coming out and got kind of stuck in mud, not sublime anymore. So what does that tell us? It's the same animal. The meanings we attach to the animal are not just associated with the animal. They are defined by the way in which the animal is represented, right? So this is really important. It's about the power art has to construct metaphors, to ingrain metaphors in our mind, right? And in this case, it really shows us how the history of art has been incredibly important in shaping our understanding of nature and our conception of anthropocentric life. Look at this beautiful chameleon, again, engulfed in the darkness here of what looks like a tropical scenario. It represents exoticism. But how about this chameleon? Oops, doesn't quite look as charming and alluring and elegant, but isn't this what chameleons are known for? Their ability to see the world in a way we could never see, right? So again, the same idea. It's not the animal that is sublime on its own. The animal brings in 50% of the sublime quality. The rest is actually defined by us, the way we look at the animal, the way we frame and contextualize its sublime charge. Again, gorillas. This is one of the sexiest gorillas ever. You can see the intensity of the gaze and the pose. It's like the Marlon Brandos of gorillas. But like us, ouch, they can let their guard down, and then the sublime guard goes out of the window. It is really fascinating how um, animals are really have been represented by us in ways that are extremely, extremely structured, fictionalized, and constructed to embody our feeling. You can see, like, this is the gorilla we want to be, right? This ain't the gorilla we want to be. So, animals are reflections of our feelings in the way we represent them. We do this almost subliminally and unconsciously. We want our big cats to represent our fierceness, right? And we want them to run gloriously in the sea. That's exactly where tiger lives. There's a whole tradition of tigers online that happen to be on the beach. But the tiger that we're actually perhaps more familiar with in our encounters is the tiger of the zoo, which is a diminished tiger, all in all. Again, lions on the beach. I don't know where this genre really originates from, but online it's really charged and present. And right here, this is the lion we actually tend to encounter most often at the zoo, the bored lion. And again, horses, they all happen to be on the beach. By the way, this is no coincidence. The sea is a symbol of the origin of life. It's dramatic, it's endless, it's mysterious. So taking these animals to the beach to photograph them, since by the way, they don't live on the beach, is another way to construct their sublimity, to structure them as symbols of our strength, of our emotions, instead of capturing them or trying to represent them for what they might be. That's where the photographic production of today gets its cues, natural artistry of the past, right? And again, as I said, artistry has more than one thing to explain and own about this representation. There is this notion that animals have to do entertaining things for us. What is a painting of an animal sleeping telling us? Not much, but look at this fierce lion that's faced by the threat of an anaconda. And look at this attack, again, a deer in this torrent. It's like dramatic. It's about survival. It's about death. Everyone pounces at once, looking to the camera. And majesty. Now, the Monarch of the Glen is actually one of the most famous painting in the history of British art, and it's by Landseer. Landseer was Queen Victoria's favorite painter. And you can see here again how this animal is really exuding patriarchal values. This is not quite the wild animal we have come to see when we walk in the woods. They usually have snot dripping off their noses, you know. They're kind of like animals, as they should be. And instead, you can see here how regal it is, looking into the distance, looking at the territory, the domain, and feeling great in the face of it all. So again, this patriarchal vein also runs in natural history. Audubon painted this eagle in a way that has clear ties with colonialism as well as patriarchy. You know, what about an eagle squatting someplace or just like relaxing? You know, why these animals are always acting for us. Again, you know, the grace, the elegance emphasized at best. And one other thing I care to point out, it's youth. All these animals are always youthful and perfect, right? These ideas that natural history embodies during the 18th century and the 19th century then come back to haunt natural history with eugenics later on during the 1920s and 30s. That's unfortunately a chapter we don't have time to explore here. One of my favorite pictures I've used for years now in this class, these polar bears. Polar bears don't walk around on two legs roaring all the time, right? But look around the representation of polar bears in museums and natural history museums, and there they are. And, again, it's because on their two legs, they really look like humans. The staging of the confrontation, casting an animal as a scary enemy, even within the context of natural history, is incredibly problematic, but we've done it over and over and over. Only recently, museums have realized that, oh, like, yeah, our polar bear is doing that too. How is it that the behavior they enact for like 10% or 5% of their lives becomes the 99% representational behavior in all museums of natural history around the world? And look at this guy here. I love that touching of the leg. That's kind of suggestive. It's like, let me just rub off some of your orsiness on me. It goes all over the place. But again, we're strange. Look at this other example. This is from the Natural History Museum in New York, and the different representation between the female and male bear, right? The female bear looks submissive in the diorama. The male bear is, again, on two legs, staring at the horizon, looking around to protect the female, to provide for the female. These representations are constant in natural history museums, even when we know that the female animal, like in the case of lions, for instance, is the one that does a lot of the hard work, And you can see these representations again, Sublime with the leopard and the landscape, the canyons opening. It's all about this dominion, because technically these are us. These taxidermy animals are not the animals. They are actors posing as humans in the natural world. So, just to summarize this, the sublime animal is always elegant, preferably regal, outstandingly beautiful, well proportioned, unblemished, and young all the time, usually exotic, because it then acquires a different dimension that relates to otherness in objectifying ways. And it could, although not always, eat you, right? There's something about this confrontation with the greatness of the animal, which is never intelligence, by the way. It's usually strength of a bodily kind, and numerous when small. Think about sardines or locusts. A swarm or a school of them becomes sublime to our eyes. But it always, above all, is a symbol. The sublime animal is an objectified animal that speaks our voices. It ventriloquizes our thoughts. That's how creepy this situation has been for a long while. Now, the contemporary part. I'm of course overrunning here again, but please stay with me and take a look at how some artists have tried to upturn this objectification by de-symbolizing animals, reinventing animal symbolism in a way that it's not anthropocentric, or even represent animals in a way that makes us think about our capitalist obsession and how capitalism has shaped our relationship with animals. This is certainly the case with Banksy, who you probably know as a very famous graffiti artist who's made quite a bit of work actually about animals, because he's an animal rights activist and vegan as well. He set up a shop called the Village Pet Store and Charcoal Grill in New York in 2008. It was one of those I came upon this, situation set up like a situationist artist would do. So he basically rented an empty shop and turned it into this strange mashup of a pet store and a charcoal grill. So at the same time, we have the animals we eat and the animals we consider our friends coming together under the same capitalist establishment. What did it look like? I'm going to show you just a tiny sequence of this clip that's really telling. So I can actually talk over this. The soundtrack is not very important, but it is about, these are animatronics. So Banksy set up the shop with this really engaging animatronics that really say something about our relationship with animals. They ask us questions about consumerism and how animals are conceptualized by us in society. Again, as you can see, as symbols most of the time, as fashion items, Okay, just wanted to skip ahead. There's a chimpanzee in a cage watching chimpanzee porn, as you can see here. Considerations on the conceptualization of animals on magazines and popular culture. And then some of my favorite moments are the swimming fish fingers. So again, drawing connections between the commoditization of animals and our arbitrary decision of what is a pet and what is something to eat. You know, most of our pets are actually pretty tasty as well. I also wanted to talk about quickly Belinda de Bruquier, an artist who uses taxidermy. Taxidermy has had a major revival in contemporary art during the past 20 years. I think we might be at the end of it now. My book, Speculative Taxidermy, was published in 2018. And it talks about this kind of taxidermy, which is the taxidermy that doesn't look naturalistic. It doesn't look like the Natural History Museum, but it's actually trying to tell us something about our relationship with animals. So what we see here is the body of the animal, the skin of the animal, most appropriately remodeled by the artist in such a way that it doesn't reconstruct the greatness of the horse, but that it actually induces a sense of empathy and vulnerability. There's something about this horse that begs, leave me alone, look what you've done to me. You can read this in so many different ways, but it's really, to me especially, a call for the acknowledgement of the violence we do to these animals through domestication and also through selective breeding. If you look into the literature of selective breeding, you'll find that these animals are subjected to horrific deformities that we have caused by crossbreeding different varieties in order to, and selecting certain genetic traits in order to accomplish our vision of what a horse should look like. And then, you know, they have heart problems, respiratory problems, and we basically perpetrate this kind of extensive generational violence on animals. And also domestication is violence. Horse racing is a violence. That is really well exemplified here in the hides used by Belinda de Bruquier, which are sourced ethically. No animal is killed for the making of the work. They're actually coming from veterinary laboratories and clinics where animals are brought to be put down because they have a disease or they died of natural causes, and then she uses them for art. Perspective and negotiating space, the way we situate ourselves in the encounter with the animal makes a difference. This is central perspective in art, which invited us to be the owners of the world by standing in the middle of it. And you can see here the work of Diana Thader, who actually makes work with projections against the walls, trying to turn the gallery space into an immersive environment in which animals lose their symbolic meanings and faces in ways that are different from our traditional encounters with them. So she stages a very different confrontation where we are not the center of it all. Now, this idea of the confrontation and encounter with the animal, which was central to animal studies for many years, was also initiated by the movement Arte Povera. Yanis Kanellis brought 12 live horses to the gallery space in Rome in 1969. And this is an assault on the classical equestrian statue or the equestrian portrait tradition, the idea of allowing the horse to show itself for what it is, not this beautified, clinically rendered animal, but the messy animal that pisses and shit right there on the gallery space. And Joseph Beuys, in 1974, staged a very unprecedented encounter in which he spent a few days in a gallery space in New York with a coyote, and you see their interaction here. Now, I really care to explain that symbolism is not always the death of the animal in the context of contemporary art. Religious symbolism, in my opinion, certainly is, because religious symbolism, or the symbolism of the sublime animal, secular symbolism, religious symbolism that intertwine, reduces the animal to zero. Zero when it comes to the animality of the animal. But there's something interesting here in what Joseph Beuys accomplishes with I Like America and America Likes Me. Here, his encounter with America is represented by the coyote, because the coyote symbolizes Native Americans. It symbolizes their beliefs. It symbolizes the notion that the coyote is a meaningful animal in Native America. So the coyote in the gallery space represents a pre-colonial America that Joseph Beuys is trying to connect with. The connecting process was playful, scary, tormentous, and enlightening. But what Joseph Beuys said at the end of the work was that he learned a lot, not about coyotes, but about this specific coyote. And I always thought that really resonated with me, because I thought, that's it. The animal is never an individual. It's never allowed to be an individual in the history of art. It has always been multiples, always a representation of the species, always something other than its individual self. And that's another violence we do to animals. So I find Joseph Beuys's work really fascinating because of that. There's actually this clip of... We don't need the audio. Okay, there you go. But there's actually this clip that survives of the installation, as well as a book that was made of photographs. So you can see how they really spend time intersecting with each other. And actually, this reminds me, yes, the shaman is a great component of the performance that Joseph Beuys staged. The idea that the shaman connected with nature on a different level that we have completely relegated to the notion of primitivism, and therefore, again, discounted as irrelevant in our culture. And to this idea of the encounter, I wanted to also introduce you to the work of Kira O'Reilly, an Irish artist who I had the pleasure to meet during my early research in London on animal studies. You know, Joseph Beuys's performance of spending time with a live animal really resonated with artists. And in 2009, Kira decided to spend time falling asleep with a pig, because she thought that falling asleep is what really is communal ground between us and many animals. How, it's impossible to penetrate the minds of animals. We will never know what goes on in them, but that doesn't mean that nothing is going on in them. And we know that animals' dreams, those of you who have dogs or cats know how you can sort of see some of their movements, some of their reactions to something that's going on kind of oniric level. So this enclosure was set up especially for Kira to spend time with Delia, the pig, and sleep together. You know, there was this beautiful romantic quality, very down to earth, quite clearly. As you can see, Kira wanting to spend time with her pig on the same level. You know, it's really fascinating. You can see here how the pig was also allowed to enter Kira's space through a ramp, so there was never a complete separation. But this setup that was designed especially for the installation was also designed to bear in mind that the house itself is a symbol of a separation between us and the natural world. So it wasn't enough for Kira just to lie on the hay and just pretend that we never separated ourselves from it. So that's what the structure also represents. And I also wanted to mention that Kira, who's a very well-known performance artist, created the piece Falling Asleep with a Pig in response to this other piece that preceded it, called In the Wrong Placeness, in which, perhaps in a way that's more in line with the tradition of 60s and 70s performance art, she wrestled naked with the body of a dead pig. A very interesting performance that came nonetheless under a lot of criticism from those who asked her, why use a dead pig instead of encountering a live one, which then prompter to respond with another piece. I think from an artistic perspective, this sense of playfulness, dialogue, and openness that Kira enacts is also important to consider. And there she is. As you can see, these are photographs taken from In the Wrong Placeness, which really is an existentialist questioning of what the animal and the human relationship can be about. What is the incommunicability between animal and human? Here also emphasized by the taxidermy animal that pretends to be alive, but it's actually well dead. Also, how do you harness, how do you prevent animals from becoming objects in your own work? Well, Hubert Duprat harnessed the creativity of animals by allowing these larvae to create encasements that they usually produce with little bits of stones and branches and leaves that they find at the bottom of rivers with precious materials. So there's actually a collision between the seeming randomness of nature and messiness of nature and the precious materials that us humans have used in time. When the insect emerges from the larvae and becomes an adult, it flies away, leaving behind the beautiful case that becomes an art object created by an animal. Or artist Rene, who's actually a beekeeper and has used the ability of bees to build in order to create these beautiful sculptures in which bees no longer live, but that are a kind of collaboration, if you like, between artist and animal. So collaborating with the animal is also a big trope in contemporary art. I love these mended spider webs by Nina Kachadurian, who noticed that spider webs get damaged. They usually get damaged when an insect falls into them, and actually the spider runs to the spot to wrap around and wrap the insect to take it away, and then eventually the spider will come back to fix the damage. But one of the things that's fascinating is really how she tried to fix these spider webs with threads, and then returned to the site the following day after taking these photographs to notice that the spider would just basically isolate her amendments and drop them to the ground and amend the web itself, which is a very poetic, playful, and very simple notion of this, again, division between us and animals, and our will and desire to help sometimes being completely irrelevant to the animal itself. I thought they're particularly intricate and beautiful and nonetheless very poetic. Ken Ronaldo's a bioartist who works at the intersection of art and science, created this interesting installation in which Siamese fighting fish are fitted with robotic extensions in order to navigate the out of water space. Now, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the betta splendens is called, or Siamese fighting fish. They are fish that have been selected because of the male's territoriality. They're very aggressive. In Thailand, where they have been selectively bred for over 100 years, they were used for fighting, like cockerel fighting, dog fighting, and they're absolutely stunning. For drama effect, the fins have been selectively bred to look incredibly enlarged and colorful. And what's fascinating about this fish is that they're super intelligent. You can see their inquisitive minds exploring the world if you have them in a fish tank. You never get bored with a fighting fish. But what Ken Ronaldo noticed is that a fighting fish can remember you and will look at you from inside the tank. So he thought, if I actually place them in juxtaposed tanks where they can see each other, they'll probably relate to each other, which they did, moving around the robotic structures through sensors, and also relate to the visitors. So again, an installation that harnesses the intelligence, the perceptual ability of the fish in order to emphasize. There's no symbolic value here, as I hope you can appreciate. There's nothing about the fish representing this or that in Christianity or being a sublime being. And also Celeste Boissier-Mongenot, very interesting artist, who again set up a very strange space for finches involving musical instruments and allowing them to inhabit the space so that they could create sound. Finches are very versatile and they're capable of living well in a gallery environment. Some animals will do better than others. This is another issue with bringing animals in the gallery space. Those who have been domesticated will fare better. Some animal rights activists object to the presence of any animal in the gallery space. This is the subject of another lecture altogether. But I just wanted you to bear in mind that this is also something that can be staged in order to foreground the behavior of the animal. Oh, sorry, I wanted to play you this clip. There you go. That's my favorite one, is like the Jimi Hendrix of finches, right? One of the questions this piece raises to the fore is this notion of intentionality and authorship, right? The piece is made by the finches, the space is staged by the artist. Do the finches realize that there is a connection between the sound they create and the movement of objects around the space? Ultimately, birds are very acoustically driven beings, so it was extremely fascinating to have the opportunity to navigate this space. And most recently, Pierre Huyghe came to fame on the international scene with a number of works of art involving the Anthropocene, and also, as you can see here, the relationship between classical art and conceptual posthumanism, the notion of the hive mind more specifically. His work also includes live animals at times, like the dog called Human that you see here, which roams his exhibitions. And just a quick introduction to what is posthumanism in the context of bioart as well, before I let you go. Two of the most important author of posthumanism, Hales and Haraway. These are books I warmly recommend. Posthumanism emerged roughly at the end of the 1970s and 80s, and has become really, has gained a lot of momentum more recently. And it's basically, very much in a nutshell, I'm really diluting this to nothing, but it's the blurring of the boundaries between human, animal, and machine, in the acknowledgement that an isolation of these entities would actually create a distorted manifestation of what the contemporary world is about. When you think about the impact of technology on our bodies and our ways in which we communicate, and also our constant becoming and enmeshment with animal life that define ourselves. There's an interesting book called What is Posthumanism by Kari Wolf that you might want to read. It has a very controversial chapter on art and posthumanism. What does it mean to be posthuman? It means to be post-human, beyond humanism, beyond Descartes and his central anthropocentric conception of us being the center of everything. And most importantly, it means to decentralize our thinking, right? We talk a lot about decolonizing everything, but the ultimate decolonization really lies in decentralizing our thinking in everything we do. A lot of the gender and race discourses we entertain today are still caught up in a very anthropocentric dimension. And it's only when we're able to develop those discourses outside of anthropocentrism that true change will take place. Don't forget that we can spend our days and nights arguing about gender and race, but if the planet croaks, it croaks, and there will be nothing to talk about when that happens. So That's our biggest challenge. So I just wanted to wrap up this within the context of posthumanism and bioart. What does it mean when you hear bioart? Bioart is art that involves living organisms and most often working in the laboratory, like some artists do. Again, rejecting all that we have discovered today about animal symbolism, the allegorical use of animals. You can see here Eduardo Katz, who actually works at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, GFP bunny in 2000. It's a laboratory bunny developed in collaboration with a cancer research laboratory in France. It is a genetically modified animal whose DNA includes jellyfish DNA. So it's meant to glow in the dark under blue light. And I also wanted to show you an earlier example of genetically modified or altered animal art, sorry, plant art in this case. You can see the delphiniums that were hybridized and treated by Steichen to become gigantic. This was actually staged at the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 1936, and the idea was to question authorship. What is art? Can my manipulation as an artist, like Edward Steichen, very well-known photographer, be a collaboration, if you like, or a molding of natural life? So this idea of changing, mutating, interfering with the natural world and creating shapes and colors, isn't this the ultimate dream of classical art? To make something, a work of art, live. And again, returning to Eduardo Katz and the recent work on plants, plants have become all the rage in the discourses of posthumanism right now. He created Edunia. Edunia is a petunia which includes parts of his DNA and sections of his DNA. And again, of course, the questions here are what are our ethical responsibility towards a plant that, as we know now, includes part of human DNA. But it also reminds us of the genetic continuity between us and other non-humans. It reminds us of this biocontinuity that we deliberately have decided to forget and exclude from the narratives of humanity and humanism.